What is going on, y'all? I'm KM Best, joined by Jeff Hoogland over at Hooglandia Snap, and of course, Jeff Hoogland on Twitch. And we are here because, once again, we are locked in mortal intellectual combat about a Marvel Snap card we disagree on. Oh, you faced the wrong way, I faced the wrong way too. Okay, perfect. This is the Great Debate, Mobius edition. Let's talk about Mobius and Mobius. Jeff, you have what I would consider a controversial stance to start us out on. Go for it.
My opinion on Mobius is relatively straightforward. I think Marvel Snap is a significantly better game post Mobius than it was before Mobius released.
And I want to dive into that, right? Because my stance on Mobius is it feels like he is enforcing a specific type of mid-range good cards deck, and him, along with his cohorts at the 2-cost spot, are just like, well, what we're going to do is we're going to force you to play the game our way, and then you have to play the game our way, and anything you do to change how the game is played, you don't get to do anymore. So that my contention on Mobius is that he is so powerful as to be so powerful in enforcing a certain type of extremely fair gameplay that it reduces, I would say, deck diversity in terms of play style. And you're someone who plays like a ton of different decks. I would like to get your perspective on this. Do you feel like more things are viable now with Mobius, or do you feel like certain decks are less?
Even just go back to that metagame right before Mobius released, right? If I recall, my best decks video that I did before Mobius came out, it was a Loki deck and then like 5 different flavors of Wave into Doctor Doom, essentially,
Right.
because Wave was like the one thing people had kind of decided could keep up with, and anything that could maybe also keep up was getting locked out by Wave on that 5th turn of the game.
For the record, I don't think Wave kept up with Loki. I don't think anything did. And
so I actually agree with you on that. I don't think the Wave decks kept up with Loki, but what the Wave decks did was they locked decks that could potentially keep up with Loki. So you had like the Loki that went over the Wave, and then the Wave decks were just popular enough that anything that could reasonably go into Loki often struggled with only playing a single card on the final turn of the game.
So to give the specific example, like Cerebro 3, right? Like that is a deck that I actually genuinely think had a good matchup into Loki, and then just got like heinously ruined by like everyone playing High Evolutionary because you couldn't play your own Luke Cage, or you'd turn off your Valkyrie and your Shadow King, and you just get like completely demolished, and every High Evo deck is a Wave deck, and so it's just like, okay, well, that's kind of unplayable now. I do think there is some of that. There is a degree to which Loki's, the other decks that were viable and Loki's ubiquity meant that people were just like, I just want to play something that isn't Loki. And then that ended up sort of making Loki stronger. I agree with that, but I don't think we should look at that metagame as a model for like, it's kind of like the lowest bar on Earth, right? Like, it's like Mobius made the Loki meta better. It's like, yeah.
I think that metagame, though, was kind of exemplifies problems that we've had over the course of Marvel Snap's history, though, pre-Mobius, and that is Wave has basically, at a fundamental level, been a card that you couldn't interact with profitably, and it created this kind of lockout style gameplay that there just wasn't counterplay into before Mobius. You either played into it or you died to it, and the best way to play into it involves playing cards that were good with Wave, and at that point you're like, well, if I'm playing cards that are good with Wave, I might as well be a Wave deck as well.
Well, I think that's actually interesting, because one of the things that I've noticed recently is like, people are just like, look, I could play Wave in this deck, but I would lose every mirror, so I'm not playing Wave in this deck anymore. Like, the move decks are just like, well, I'm not doing that anymore. And these are decks that are running Mobius. They can just be like, I can do this one-sided Wave thing, but it's not worth it because they're also playing that, and then instead of a Wave on turn 5, they play a Vision, and I immediately die, right? Like, that's the interesting bit to me.
I think one of the things that we differ a little bit on is In my opinion, a tech card like Mobius is never responsible for the format that exists. Mobius is a card that's purely a reactive card to things that could happen to you. It's a preventative measure. I'm not putting Mobius in my deck and then building around him. I'm putting Mobius in my deck because of what my opponents might be doing to me that I don't want to happen.
Yes, I think that's reasonable, but I don't think that means it's never something that defines metagames. I think Shang-Chi has absolutely defined metagames. And for an example, I would point to the metagame before Loki, where everyone was playing what you call little movers and brood, decks that were explicitly built to blank Shang-Chi. Like, these are the explicit purpose of those decks is to put as much power on the board as you can while not being vulnerable to Shang-Chi, because running Shang-Chi comes at the cost of actually putting him in your deck. And if you can blank, say, Shang-Chi and Enchantress out of a Darkhawk deck while contesting the Darkhawk, you are in a very good position because you're only playing 9 cards in a Marvel Snap game. If 2 of them aren't cards, you're at a very significant advantage. And I think that it would be incorrect to say Shang-Chi did not define that metagame. It was actually a metagame in which he was very weak, but he was the reason it existed.
I agree with you that Shang-Chi was defining that metagame, but would you say because Shang-Chi was defining that metagame that Shang-Chi needed to change?
No, I wouldn't. But I don't think that that's necessarily an argument that it never needed to
Mobius need
change.
to change when he's defining the current metagame then? What's the difference? What's the problem?
I feel like Mobius promotes incredibly samey deck building. Like, if you talk to a lot of the high elo players, they'll tell you kind of the same thing, which is like every deck is kind of the same right now. It's Elsa, it's Mobius, it's Luke Cage, it's whatever other tech card, and then it's whatever shell you want to shove that in. You shove that in the move deck, you shove that in the brood deck, you shove that in the Loki deck. It's just, it's the same thing. And I think the reason for that is that Mobius is restricting anyone from actually doing other stuff, right? Like, what are you going to do? Play Sarah? Like, what are you going to do?
So, to even take Sarah, for example, Sarah wasn't a deck in the metagame before Mobius existed either.
Correct.
And there's actually been Sarah decks putting up stats in a post-Mobius world because in one, the Sarah deck gets to play Mobius, so it's no longer just dead to rights to wave. And 2,
Yeah.
unless they're saving their Mobius for exactly turn 5, which a number of decks can't afford to do with their curves, you have opportunities to counterplay Mobius. Mobius is a card that you can rogue it, you can enchantress it, you can Lady Deathstrike it more recently in decks that aren't Sarah. So there's ways to maneuver around it where you have to consider this back and forth mechanic of it.
I do wonder if it's not just Mobius who I'm blaming as like the leader of this sort of cohort of ridiculous stuff, but it just feels like every deck I play, it's like, okay, here's my Kitty Pryde, here's my Elsa, here's my Angela, here's my Mobius, here's my Luke Cage. They're all the same deck, and it's just like, or it's like, here's my Jeff, here's my other payoff for Kitty.
I don't agree with you. You're right. There's a lot of
Really?
decks that like fit that same core of cards, but I don't look at that and go, this is Mobius that creates this tension so much as I look at it and go, this just seems like kind of the natural bubbling point of this powerful tech cards and like no multi-deck, no sideboard. It's all best of one that Marvel Snap has, right? Like in any other game, like coming from my Magic the Gathering background, cards like Mobius and Luke Cage, and even things like Shang-Chi to a degree, these would be sideboard cards that you wouldn't play to start, but you would bring them in when they're good. And Marvel Snap, because you have such a high chance to draw them, you basically have to preload those polarized effects to start because you're not going to have a chance to have them in a game 2 or a game 3.
So, given that you think effectively what's happening is every deck is pre-boarding, like, wouldn't the argument then be, and I'll be honest, people are going to be like, what's the difference between Mobius and Armor? And it's like, I'll be honest, I've thought Armor and Cosmo probably should have gotten nerfed at some point, too. I definitely
someone
thought
left
that.
a comment on one of my videos that really resonated with me. They said, if Armor was released today, people would scream about it like they scream about Mobius.
Yeah.
It would just
Legitimately,
be like, this
they would,
is
though.
absurd. It's pushed.
It
It's
is
busted. What is second dinner thinking?
Yeah, and that's because, like, honest to God, there were metas where I was like, that shouldn't be a 2/3. That card is definitely better than being a 2/3. Like, it
And
should probably
and
be a 2/2.
even taking the example you're talking about Luke Cage being omnipresent in all these decks, and I agree, it's been a must include, but even that is a result of this kind of pressure cooker tech card arms race, right? Like the only reason Luke Cage is in every deck is because Shadow King's a 2 energy card now.
Hell yeah. Let's go. Like, I mean, yeah, Luke Cage is in every deck of Shadow King is a 2 energy card because Man Thing just came out. And I will say Luke Cage is just like there. I feel like the thing with Luke Cage and Mobius that really strikes me is they're not just good. They like free win you a decent percentage of games, like 5% of games or whatever. You just like free win because you're running them, and it's just like, oh,
They're incredibly polarizing effects.
yes. And I just feel like there probably should be a limit on that where it's just like, oh my God. I do think that they are like, I'll be real about this. I think they are in line with Armor, but I think Armor is like a ridiculous card. Maybe that makes me the weird one, but like Armor is a card in the same vein, genuinely. It's just a little bit worse in the context of what we're doing.
Big difference between those two cards is Cage and Mobius, the two cards that are kind of omnipresent right now, is their global effects, right? Like you put them in one lane and they impact everything. Whereas at least Armor and Cosmo, you're like, all right, well, we can't touch that one, but these other ones we still have to work with here. And Luke is even that. I was watching a stream this evening and I was like, I can't believe someone else hadn't thought of this. In their Luke Cage arm race, they were playing Invisible Woman to just put Luke Cage behind the Invisible Woman. So just like they can't tag your Cage. So they have to like, go through your effect twice to get to this card because it's just so powerful.
Yeah, I don't even think I think Invisible Woman's like genuinely kind of an underplayed card. And that's another card where like if she came out right now, people would be like, what the fuck? But like I do want to go back to that because I actually think that's a good, illustration of the difference, right? Armor released in the sort of Mobius era would be global, right? Like that card would be global now. I feel like that's the equivalent of what like Armor but Mobius would be. It'd be like 2/2 or 2/3, and it would be global, and it would be ridiculous, right?
I think coming back to like the core of our base topic here on Mobius itself, I think my personal opinion on Mobius and my experience as someone who, plays a new deck every 90 minutes and has to try and work outside the box and not pull his hair out to be a little bit entertaining is Mobius made my job easier. It lets me brew in more ways than other formats did when I was dealing with Wave. And I think Mobius is powerful in large part due to Wave not having other counterplay. I know I personally, if I had other cards I could play that would let me play through Wave, I wouldn't have Mobius in every one of my decks. But that isn't an option, right? Like even going back to Luke Cage, right? Like if I want to interact with Luke Cage, I can play Rogue, I can play Lady Deathstrike, I can play Enchantress, and probably something else I'm forgetting about too. But with interacting or stopping Wave from locking me out of a game, Mobius is it. Maybe Magic if you squint, but that's like a risky squint.
The T5 Magic is brutal though. You do absolutely ruin them with that. I do have a question then, because you are definitely someone who brews, who plays weird stuff. Are you still running into a lot of Wave? Because I think what's getting me about Mobius is like, I haven't seen a Wave in like forever outside of like random Galactus cheesers who are still doing it.
I put Bounce together today to test Forge with Falcon, and I didn't play Mobius, and I put Luke Cage in the deck. And I was like, there just hasn't been enough Wave that this was the result I wanted. I wanted the format to get to a point where I didn't feel obligated to play Mobius because he actually had an impact. And part of why I think it's taken so long to get to that point is just think back to the first week or two Mobius was released. How many good Marvel Snap players were still just shoving Wave in every deck despite Mobius being something most people were playing? It was like, in a perfect world, we play Mobius, people adjust and Wave dies down, but that isn't what actually happened. So you had to keep playing this polarizing tech card until people slowly eventually got pushed out of their comfort zone and tried new things.
So the issue I have is I don't think I can cut him. ever. I don't think I can cut him ever. It's not about Wave, it's about Loki, right? Because if you are playing a deck that is like attempting to put points on the board and you run into Loki and you do not have a Mobius, it is still just like, oh, well, I'm dead. I can't actually beat that deck.
The bounce deck, for example, that I enjoy playing. I don't play Iron Man,
right.
So there's no individually
good
cards
steals
in my deck. That deck was one of the decks that I mentioned earlier that had a reasonable Loki matchup, but just bit it to Wave on turn 5 because you just couldn't ever play the game. So that is the kind of deck where, okay, I can play into Loki, but I don't have to play Mobius now because Wave has finally pushed off of the format.
The interesting thing is, I think Mobius is just so strong that you probably should play him anyway, and that's the thing I have the issue with, because, like, okay, so I haven't seen a Wave in forever. I still don't build a deck without the guy. For Loki, for Elysium, for Dream Dimension, for any of this stuff, it's just like, he's better Luke Cage. And this is the best Luke Cage has ever been. This is like apex Luke Cage. He's never been better than he is right now. Even when High Evo first came out, he has never been better than he is right now because of the amount of Shadow King, because of the release of Man Thing, because of all this stuff. This is as good as he's ever been. And Mobius is still in the deck faster. And I feel like that's a problem, right? Like, couldn't he at least lose a power? Be comparable to Luke Cage? Like, isn't that so bad?
My deck would love Mobius to lose the power. That sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually kind of surprised that nobody did like Mobius Wave Cerebro 3 yet. That's an idea that I cooked up and then just was like, this is terrible. But now you can Mobius Wave into Eliath in Cerebro 3.
Correct.
So we're cooking now. But like, yeah, no, I just see like, first of all, hold on. We're going to take a tangent here. You just did a thing that people do all the time, which is like anytime a card gets nerfed, they're like, actually, it's better in Cerebro X. And they do like, actually, it's better in Mr. Negative, right? You see those two all the time. And I just wanted to call that out. If you, in the comments, make those comments, I don't want to hear it. I've heard it a million trillion times. When they nerfed Bishop in the beta, they were like, oh, better in Mr. Negative. When they nerfed Angela in the beta, oh, better in Mr. Negative.
Is a direct quote from Glenn Jones, who has been the principal balance lead in Marvel Snap since like the beginning of the year, I believe. He wasn't quite at release, but like since the beginning of the year, a while now, where he said he has literally never considered Mr. Negative in balancing the power of a card, which is the correct approach. One,
it's correct. It's never been right.
I love it, but it sucks.
Terrible.
And two, if you do make an adjustment and it breaks Mr. Negative, you deal with it after the fact. You don't worry about that preemptively.
Yeah. So like, I just wanted to call that out. Like if you're one of those people that like, whenever something like that happens, you're like, oh, this is better in Cerebro X, or oh, this is better in Mr. Negative. Trust me, they don't care. They do not care. There is no risk of that shit happening. Like, we are very, I would consider us vanishingly unlikely to be up here talking about the great Mr. Negative debate at any point in the future. I do not think that is likely. I don't think we're going to have the great Cerebro debate. I don't think those are things we're going to be talking about. That said, I do want to like circle us back to Mobius, and in the context of Mr. Negative, I think he's actually a really interesting card, because my instinct is anytime I see someone playing Mr. Negative, I'm like, oh my god, you cannot be serious. I'm just going to end the game right now. And I think you actually have a different perspective on that, where you think it's somehow better, and I'm a little...
I think Mr. Negative is actually better positioned post-Mobius than it was pre-Mobius, just simply by virtue of the fact that you can play cards that interact with Mobius, and you couldn't always play cards to interact with something like Wave happening or other pieces of interaction that were coming before. I don't think Mr. Negative is good by any means, but I think it's marginally less bad than it was in prior formats, thanks to Rogue and Lady Deathstrike being cards that you can like organically play in the shell that also clean Mobius off the board.
I feel like viewers of this may be mad at me for only really grokking this right now, but it feels like almost everything you say about Mobius is in relation to Wave, where it's entirely just like, look, I really hate Wave. I hate her so much. She ruins my
think
shit, and
Wave
now I
is
don't get to get
responsible.
ruined.
Wave, and you and I probably have a very different perspective on Wave because, in my opinion, Wave is typically terrible into decks that are good, while at the same time it shit stomps everything that's remotely off meta that could be trying to keep up with something that's good. Like anytime I have a
Um,
deck where I'm like, this is kind of good or can kind of keep up with whatever the tier one deck is, you run into the B tier wave deck and you're like, actually 0%, can't win, pick my cards up, go home.
So I actually do agree that Wave serves mostly a role as a meta gatekeeper rather than anything
Yep.
else. But what I'm interested in is like, okay, the specific play pattern that Wave is good against is I'm going to play a lot of points on turn 6. And
I don't
so
even think it's I want to play a lot of points on turn 6. I think Wave is often good into I just want to make more than one play on turn 6. Like I
yeah,
have a number of decks where like I just want to play 2 cards. Like I'm not even trying to like hit monkey
yes.
the board, but it's like I need to play my second card to have a chance this game, and I can't play my Shang-Chi plus my Lizard or my Enchantress
Yes.
plus my Demon, and it's just we're dead now.
Yeah, a lot of Wave's utility in previous metas was actually preventing Darkhawk from being able to do this, right? Like a
Yeah.
Darkhawk deck really needs to play 2 very impactful cards on the final turn of the game. That's like the best thing you can do. That's like the second most important turn to have Zabu on is so you can
And
do
even
2 threes.
talking about Zabu and Darkhawk, I've heard from a lot of people that Mobius killed a bunch of cards. And when they list out the
Yeah.
cards that Mobius killed, none of these cards were playable in the format before it released because those cards were already pushed out by Loki and Wave.
Right. I don't think that's quite fair though, because I think when people talk about that, they mean in the format before that format. Because like I think the way I look at Loki season is basically just like a blip, right? Like, it's just like that. And we're never going back there. I checked my stats the other day. I had like a 63% win rate over like 800 games with Loki at high infinite. And it was just like, that shouldn't be possible unless something is very wrong. I feel like that kind of win rate over that kind of sample size with that kind of competition is just like, that's not supposed to happen. Like, it's not supposed to be numbers like that in a card game. And I don't think it's really fair to be like, okay, well, Mobius makes it better than that, because I think everyone kind of agrees that sucked. But like when you go back and look at the previous meta,
actually really enjoyed Loki's release week. I mean, like we went back and forth with that last time on Loki, right? And like
we did.
if you go back and like watch my experience and my joy building and brewing things, I actually had a really great time building and brewing until people decided they wanted to play Wave High Evolutionary, and then all the brewing stopped and it was
Really?
just dead to rights. Yeah.
That's fascinating because I basically never played against Wave decks. I only played against Loki decks. And I was just throwing stuff at the wall like, okay, does this beat them? Does this beat them? And just it never did.
Well, and part
never...
of that I think is the psychology too, right? Because you probably hit some Wave decks, but like Loki just rolled over those because it was really good into the Wave decks. Whereas like my experience was, okay, I'm trying to beat Loki and I can do that with some consistency, but every time I hit a wave, I might as well just retreat for one or two when they snap me when they realize what I'm doing.
Which is why I played more games of Loki that season than any other deck. It's not exactly that it was the best deck ever. It might have been. I don't really know. Probably like Sarah Negative is better. But like it was positioned such that its counters were so esoteric that they would lose to someone just doing stuff. Right? Not even necessarily wave stuff, but its counters had to be built in such a specific and fragile manner that you ended up with bad matchups into basically everything else, right? And so I don't actually think that's like a Wave issue necessarily. Wave's just like the poster girl for that. Like she's the thing that is most of what everything else is. But like you're probably losing to like most weird mid-range decks too, aren't you?
Here's an interesting comparison I would like to hear from you.
Okay.
You think Mobius is problematic because it's auto-included? Is Luke Cage problematic? Why or why not?
Yeah. I think, first of all, I think Mobius is like a little bit more problematic because it's just better, right? Like the comparison between Mobius and Luke Cage is one of like, okay, one of these is clearly better than the other. Like, and that was actually the comparison we made with Mobius before it was released, which is like, all right, well, if you look at Luke Cage, this kind of does the same thing to the same number of locations, but affects more actual cards and has a better stat line. So it's like very clearly better. And so I feel like Mobius's auto include status forces me into playing just here's a bunch of good card decks. Whereas Luke Cage is a specific answer for a specific thing I pay a cost for. But I'm paying a cost for Luke Cage.
What was the format where you weren't just playing a bunch of good cards, though? Shuri?
I mean, like, Shuri was a synergy deck. I would say that Brood is legitimately a synergy deck. The move decks.
I mean, even looking back at the formats before Loki, because those are like more recent decks. Shuri still competitive aside, but like the Darkhawk deck, that was the best deck for a long time, and that's just a collection of good cards, right? Like you can squint and say there's a synergy with.
I actually think there's a huge overlap there, like in terms of the roles these decks have. Yeah,
I think Marvel Snap has basically always had a bias outside of like some blips with negative in the closed beta, where these kind of generically decks full of good cards tend to be powerful.
So for me, Mobius is like a 10 out of 10, and Luke Cage is like an 8 out of 10, right?
But
like
they're both auto includes in all your decks, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're both from a deck building perspective. I don't care which is higher or stronger. They're both cards are like I'm starting with 10 cards today.
Luke is significantly less of that in my mind, to be completely honest with you. Like Luke is significantly less of an auto include. I'm actually gonna go check some stats recently. Just to pull this up. I'm looking at the card stats leaderboard on SnapFan. And so what I'm getting at is I don't think this is just me. Like Mobius is much more of an auto include. Over the last 30 days, rank 100 plus, collection level 3,000 plus. Mobius is in 20% of decks, and Luke Cage is in 13. Like and that's actually like A, he's in more decks. B, he costs tokens and Luke Cage is effectively free. Like if you're at 3,000 collection level, you got Luke Cage for free. And he's being played in about 30% more decks.
I'm not going to argue against Mobius and Luke Cage being auto includes. I agree with you that they generally are auto includes. My general position on the cards, however, is that they're auto includes because of the surrounding things around them that they're responding to. If the things that they were responding to were less polarized and powerful, they'd be less necessary. And those two cards, in large part, are the only auto include because there's no diversity in the role that they provide. Like if we had other cards that could fill half or part of their role, it's like there's a choice between Rogue and Enchantress. There's a choice between Shang-Chi and now this cheap Shadow King. There's no choice between Mobius and the next best card that lets me not die to wave. There's no choice between Luke Cage and the next card that stops Shadow King from nuking my thing off the face of the planet. And I think that lack of diversity and answers is the core of the problem that we see with them.
Right. I just think that
more things that can fill that role, or the things that they're responding to need to be less powerful, so that way when you can't respond to them, you're not just dead to rights.
I think there is something to be said for that kind of dead to rights gameplay in Snap, especially when it's like telegraphed on 5 and you like get to know about it. You don't like lose for 8 or whatever the hell, right? Like there is something to be said about that as like a playstyle people enjoy, right? But I think when you compare Mobius and Luke Cage, I don't think it's fair to draw an equivalency between them. I don't think it's fair to say, they're both auto includes, right? One of them is much more of an auto include than the other. One of them is much more, I run this in everything.
I would honestly argue that if the stats say Mobius is only 20%, that's not even something I would consider to be an auto include, to be fair. Like 1 in 5 is not really that high for a card that doesn't define your deck and have it built around it. It's just a tech card that you can slot in as an answer to things. It's not like Angela or Kitty Pryde, right? Where like I put
it actually is like Angela in terms of play rate.
It's not.
In terms of play rate, it's not that far off.
So I'm not talking about play rate. I'm talking about how the card goes into deck building and why the percentage is okay. So a card like Mobius, I tell you my deck has Mobius in it, and you could still think of theoretically lots of combinations of 11 other cards that I could be playing. I tell you my deck
Yes.
has Angela in it, you can probably tell me 3 to 4 other cards that are in my deck because Angela is in my deck. Angela is a package card where when she's too present, she really makes a lot of decks samey because the same cards are always good with her. Whereas Mobius is not a package card. It's a reactive card that protects you from what your opponent is doing. So that protection is good in a variety of places and can be paired with a variety of things.
So I've got some more numbers to throw at you then, because that 20% was over the last 30 days, which of course includes a period before Mobius was actually out. When you restrict it to last 7 days, rank 100 plus, collection level 3000 plus, Mobius is fourth, 43% of decks, above America Chavez, and Luke Cage is at 32% of decks. Mobius here would be the fourth most played card behind Jeff, Elsa, and Eliath, right? And I think that lines up a lot more with my experience, right? Because in the previous one, it was like 10th.
My next
Would that be
question
sufficient?
is, you said you're only looking at people that are 100 plus, right?
Yeah, I did. That's what I sorted
How
by.
many players that are 100 plus are running that tracker?
I don't know. Do you think it's an
So, like,
unrealistic sample size? Like, because we're looking at the sample size here, and it appears to be about
tough,
20K.
right?
It appears
It's
to be about
also
20K.
20,000. But again, how many people are those numbers coming from? All of these
Right.
trackers and the stats on them, you have that self-selection bias where
There
only
is.
people putting numbers into them are the ones that are choosing to play it.
Yeah.
And those,
No, absolutely.
it's also worth noting that the types of people that are willing to run a tracker are going to tend to be more biased towards playing certain types of ways with certain types of mindsets and levels of competition.
I agree, but I do think that it says something that even in whatever the sample you would call it, right? Like Elsa Bloodstone is a card that just came out and is, I think, pretty undeniably more accessible than Mobius in terms of just like how much you have to pay to get the card, especially since Mobius is no longer in caches. And it is like a defining card in the metagame, one of the absolute best things you can do. So many decks are built around it, and it is at 46%, and Mobius is at 43%. And it's like, okay, that feels like a number that is very, how do you say? That feels like a number that is ubiquitous to a point that it restricts strategies, right? Like when you look at...
I think Elsa and Angela and cards like those are problematic when they reach percentages like what you are talking about.
Okay, but not Mobius.
Because of that package nature. Because Mobius isn't a card that makes your deck building predictable and similar because it can get slotted into a variety of different things. Whereas Elsa, if Elsa's a must-play card, suddenly every other card that pairs optimally with Elsa becomes a must-play card, and that really limits what you have to do. And I think it's not ideal when cards like Luke Cage or Mobius feel like they're an auto-include, but at least when those cards feel like they're an auto-include, they're only one slot in your deck instead of 5 or 6 cards in your deck. And I think that the style of card in that nature makes what percentage is tolerable for how much is being played different between those two different cards. It's just not like this card, it's this percentage, and any card that crosses that percentage is not okay.
Right. I just think that when I think of the package, Mobius is part of it. When I think of like how every deck that I come across is some form of Elsa Mobius deck, right? Like that's the thing that I can most reasonably expect when I queue up on ladder. Those are the cards I can most reasonably expect to see. And
but that's not really a Mobius problem. That's there's one deck that's overtuned at the top, and it happens.
But it's not one deck.
With this other,
it's not one deck.
There's one. When I say a deck, I mean a package of cards. There's one package of cards. And I agree. I mean, like they knew what they were doing when they nerfed Kitty Pryde, right? But like that Angela, Elsa, Kitty Pryde, that subset of cards that's frequently grouped together. That you're right, does include Mobius currently. That whole package is likely overtuned and will probably see some kind of adjustment.
But the issue is not all the decks that are doing Elsa Mobius stuff are doing Angela Kitty stuff, right? Like you look at the Brood deck, which is doing it with just Vision and Jeff, right? Like it's not that the other cards, Elsa and Mobius, are the cards that are
Brood deck
prominent in
just
the
got adjusted,
package.
though, right? And
It did.
The Brood deck doesn't always play Mobius, I don't believe, because it has
The Brood deck
counterplay.
does not always play Mobius, yeah, but
Correct. So it's not an auto
should.
include in that top deck.
It should.
The Elsa. I actually I would be surprised if it should.
I'm actually okay. Post nerf Brood deck. Just as an aside, I don't know if it's enough power anymore because the whole premise of the deck is like it's got to be enough power.
That's worth noting
we'll
too,
see.
right? Like that they adjusted that to target that shell. So you're right. That was a different Elsa deck, but they pulled it down.
Right, but also, like, okay, look at the move deck, right? They're not always playing Kitty and Angela. Sometimes they're still playing Wave, right? They're doing, like, Alioth stuff. They're not really built to be Kitty decks. They're doing, like, Alioth and Doom as their 6-drops. And they're running Mobius Elsa because that's what you do. Like, that's, granted, again, post-nerf, Alioth, maybe it won't be happening as much anymore. But it's like...
It's still going to be everywhere. It's very good.
But
that card's
like,
gonna get a text box change in the next 3 months. Hot take.
This is why we didn't do the great Alioth debate, because it would both of us be just saying like, yeah, we don't like Alioth, and that's the whole video. That's actually the reason why we didn't do
debate.
it.
Get it out of here.
Yeah, we don't have a debate. We just don't like the card. But I do think there is tangentially an interesting conversation to be had about what an acceptable priority win con would be. My actual opinion, as far as if you want to play a deck where it's like, I want to have my endgame prio thing happen, I think they should bring back Old Arrow. Because now there's counterplay to Wave, right? And if you're going to have this card around with counterplay to Wave, you can at least bring back the one that like actually gets countered when you flood the board, right? I don't know. That feels reasonable to me.
If you want to tangent on the crux of Alioth, I think, they talk about comparing it to Shang-Chi, where players would need to jockey for going second. And when you thought about when you failed to jockey for going second, Shang-Chi was bad to the point of being useless. But Alioth's not that, right?
It's just good,
Alioth, you fail to have priority for some reason, and it's still good most of the time. It still beats Hulks. It still beats all these cards that on reveals. It's the crux of that problem, I think, is the fact that it's absurd when you're ahead, and when you're behind, you're like, yeah, this is still probably good enough.
Yeah, it's still fine unless they Alioth me, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like unless it's the mirror, it's still probably fine. All right.
Unless they Alioth me or Doom or whatever. But yeah, no, like I think that like Mobius's sort of condensing effect on the metagame. I'm not saying Sarah would be good. I'm not saying Ravonna Renslayer would be good. Although, honestly, like new Black Widow, Goblins, Darkhawk, I'm not saying like.
And I think that's the core of where we differ. In your mind, Mobius is condensing the metagame. In my mind, Mobius is the card that lets me work outside the metagame without feeling like I have to just give up to stuff like Wave.
So it's really just for you, this card makes Wave no longer shit can you. And that's it.
Not even just Wave, but it gives you counterplay into stuff like Sarah. It makes it so Sarah has to have a 2-step process of flooding the board. They have to interact with my Wave and have their Sarah. Stuff like that, right? Like these other cards that he interacts with, they can have a chance to interact with him, but they have to do that instead of just doing their powerful thing. They have to also respect my disruption on top of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I just worry that I'm going to get sick of playing, Kitty, Angela, Mobius, Luke Cage, Shadow King, some stats, whatever package of stats. And I think the thing that, like, what's interesting to me is
I think the stats cards are too good. I agree. I think the numbers that they put out and the number of axes in which you have to profitably interact with them, I think they brought up Shadow King, acknowledging the fact that stats package was probably too good, and that Luke Cage is just too good of a card for stopping it. Honestly, I think Luke Cage could even be as low as like a 3-1, honestly, and it would still be a good at doing what it does in spots like, and obviously numbers thrown out there, etc. But I think a lot of that lack of
Yeah.
interaction is just how powerful that effect is at stopping what's going on there.
I think the rest of that lack of interaction is how powerful Mobius is at stopping decks that want to interact with your stats, right?
What
what is
interaction does Mobius stop?
what is the preeminent way of interacting with your stats, right? It's Shang-Chi. It's doing a discounted Shang-Chi with a Sarah and a Zabu. That is the preeminent way for almost all of Marvel Snap's existence that people would interact with your stats. That's what you did. And now seems like the exact right time for Shang-Chi to be good again, except if you try to invest in making your Shang-Chi cheap with Zabu, with Sarah, whatever, you don't actually get to do that. So there's no way to build a deck around the premise of that anymore because of Mobius.
Those movers decks were good when Shang-Chi was good last time, though. They were good because you could control your Angelas and your Silks didn't die and your Vision didn't die. Yes. They were good into Shang-Chi before Mobius happened.
Yeah, but back then you could still play like Shang-Chi. You could still play a Darkhawk deck. You could still do it.
You shouldn't have been.
I don't know if that's true.
That's my point. Like you're saying Shang-Chi is bad before Mobius, but the same deck before Mobius was ducking Shang-Chi.
Yes, but I think that Shang-Chi was eminently more playable in that metagame, despite the fact that the best decks were dodging it. They were good because they were dodging it. And also, this is also critical, they ran it. Like the move deck back then ran Shang-Chi. The idea was one-sided Shang-Chi, right? Like they ran Shang-Chi.
By the end of that format, a lot of people were inbreeding their decks and ducking.
And that's a healthy thing to happen, because then you can start playing a deck that is vulnerable to Shang-Chi. Like that's healthy. And right now, I don't actually think that we're in a situation that is healthy. It just seems like we're overloading on, instead of being in a metagame where the best cards are, these 4-cost interactive cards, the best cards are now these 2-cost interactive cards. And because they're these 2-cost interactive cards, they just go in everything because there's no cost associated with just throwing them in your deck. You just play the Mobius. Why would you not?
I think we agreed that a change needs to happen. I just don't think Mobius is the change that needs to happen.
If you think Luke Cage could be a 3-1, and basically every indicator says Mobius is more ubiquitous and probably stronger, why can't Mobius be a 3-3? Or 2-2 even?
I think you make Mobius a 2-2 and nothing changes, and I don't know why. Like, if your goal was to make him play less, that doesn't actually change anything, right?
My goal is not to make him play less. My goal is to make you pay a cost for the power. Like, he is an extremely powerful card that is not charging you anything. He's just 2-3. Why? I don't get it. Even Luke Cage is a little underrated, and we see how powerful he can be right there. There's just no reason for him to be that.
I want to make Mobius a 2-2. Sure.
Okay, Jeff, I want to make Mobius a 2-1.
That might be tougher because now I can't play him in Cerebro too.
Jeff, stop playing Cerebro. Jeff, stop playing Cerebro. I want to make Mobius a 2-1. You can play him in Cerebro 1 with Thanos.
Yeah, honestly, it's probably even fine at that level. And those are the kind of nerfs it's like the Shuri nerf this week, right? That we just had, right? Like those are what I refer to as it's free. Like nobody's putting down the Shuri deck because it's a 4-1.
Yes,
it's a little bit worse, and
just
do
it.
But at the core, though, I don't think that those changes address the problem, because
I actually do. Because the whole thing is they're efficient.
How many of your decks would stop playing a 2-1 Mobius?
I'd have to think about it a lot more. That's the honest answer. I would have to think about it a lot more, especially.
Maybe it shakes out that you do actually cut it from some of them, but I honestly can't envision a deck that I'm playing where I go, okay, I need this 2-3 Mobius. I'm not playing it because it's a 2-1.
Right now, it's going in everything because it's free. Right? It's a free include. It is not bad stats. I don't think it goes in
because it's free. I think it goes into everything because the alternative to having it is getting waived out of the game.
I actually just straight up, I mean, we've had the Loki conversation. I still don't like that card. But like, I think that while I agree that the cards that it answers are probably bigger problems, I don't think it's the way you want to solve those problems. The way you want to solve those problems is don't do the things that it answers. Like, don't do waves and Lokis, right? Like that would be the lesson that I would take away from that.
That genie's out of the bottle, right? Like Snap has a ton of really polarized effects like those, and it's just a kind of a core part of the design at this point.
Man, I don't know. I feel like if we can both agree on like, look, just make it a 2-1. If you're not going to cut it from anything, who cares, right? I would cut it from stuff because the package it's in is so built on being efficient that I do think meaningfully interacting, like losing 2 power is like significant, even in a deck where that 2 power is often not going to be the difference between victory and defeat.
It makes the life worse if you cut 2 points power off of it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a card whose text box is like legitimately even more part of its power than Mobius's text box. Like Alioth text box, like if you made that a 6-0, there's a decent chance it might still see play. But like if Mobius at like a 2-0, I don't think would. But
no, I think there's a point where you stop playing it. I think 1 probably isn't it. It might be 2, definitely isn't it. I think 2 would basically be a non-change, which honestly means they should probably make it, because if you could take a point off of something and it doesn't adjust the play rate, you should take the point off.
Yes, like that is something I definitely agree with, because like if people are still gonna do this all the time, there is basically no reason not to make them pay a cost. And that's my fundamental thing. I just don't think Mobius players are paying a cost right now, and I think they probably should have to pay a deck building cost. Like at least with Shang-Chi, they were paying the cost of, hey, that's a 4/3, right? That's a 4/3 that could be a card that does nothing, right? Mobius is never doing nothing. It's just never doing nothing. There's too many ways for it to be a real card, and it's a 2/3, right? It's good rate, and it's also more active than Shang-Chi was.
It mitigates location variance is the big part of it.
It mitigates location variance. I wouldn't even say it mitigates location variance. It makes location variance favorable for you.
Sure. Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
It doesn't make it. Yes, it does far more than mitigate location variance.
Yeah, I've talked about before, like your opponent snaps you on Elysium and you don't have a rogue or
it's a Mobius.
You have to leave.
Yeah, you have to leave. It's a Mobius. And it's just like, oh, that really sucks. Because actually, now that you mentioned it, Elysium is like the classic everyone loves this location. And now it is part and parcel of just the most toxic thing that can happen to you, which is turn 1 snap, play Mobius, Kitty Pride, have fun, buddy. Like it's tough. And I think I think can we agree Mobius 2-1 is a reasonable place to put him? Or is that still a bridge too far to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you're right. I think the 2-1 is the point where you start to think about it.
Yes.
And yeah, I agree. I agree. The 2-1 is the point where I start to think about it more. But honestly, I think he's still. I think I would have him in every deck that I have him in now, just at that line. I don't think everybody would have him in their deck though. I think that would reduce his play rate. I also
and that's the point.
Most people dislike eating their vegetables, and like including Mobius as a 2-1 is basically like eating a vegetable. You're just like,
sure,
it doesn't always taste good, but I probably should be doing it every day. And I'm like, at 2-3 he's a candy bar, right? You're just like, I want to do this. It's delicious. We'll do it every day.
Yes, that is exactly the issue. Stop making my decks entirely candy bars. I need to stop eating candy. Every deck I play, it's 12 candy bars. Stop it. Like, please stop. Please make me make a decision. Right now, I don't have to make any decisions. Please make me think about the cards I put in my deck. That is my objection.
What's the best Elsa Mobius pile of mush? What are
probably Loki. Probably Loki.
The Loki deck?
Yeah, the Loki deck has been my, like, sort of just default, like, yeah, that's probably the best one, right? Like, it's good even when your opponent doesn't Mobius, even when your opponent has a Mobius, and when your opponent doesn't have a Mobius, you are Loki and completely broken. So, like, that's just, like, the typical thing that I like to do. Loki's probably the best one, in my opinion. I am pretty much always convinced that if I can just, jam all that stuff in there, I'll do it. It's not the one I play the most anymore, but also I probably have more experience on Loki than a lot of people. So it might just be, I know how to get the most out of it. Who knows?
Yeah, I think contrary to what some of the common community sentiment was, the Loki decks can be fairly difficult to play because what you gotta like be able to
Oh,
identify when you're not
absolutely.
supposed to be Lokiing, and then
Yes.
when you do Loki, you gotta like piece together a game with play patterns that aren't necessarily what are straightforward to you. You're not repeating them every single game, so there's a lot of output range there that you have to figure out.
Yeah, Loki was and is a deck where you need to know, is even now more than ever actually, if you're actually a Loki deck that game. And you need to be
Yep.
able to pick that up from your opponent, and you
Is
need to
this
be able to
Loki or
say,
is it 10 stats on the last turn with Collector?
yes, like that is something that really does come up a decent amount. Like, if I go for what they have, how do I need to value the cards in my hand? There's a lot more early Lokis in this deck where it's just like, you know what, if they haven't played a Mobius, the cards in their deck are probably better than the cards in my hand, regardless of like the value of it. And the previous iterations of the Loki deck, it was very much just like you play full greed and you doesn't even matter because you can't get punished. Like you don't, punishment isn't even real. And in this one, you have to like make a lot more, I think, nuanced decisions. So I will say, yeah, no, it's probably the best one. I don't know post nerf though. I definitely just like need to figure stuff out still because things can change pretty fast. But that would be my like just if I had to like just default play a deck and grind ladder, that would be the one I would play it with, I think.
Well, I think we found some
All right,
common ground, KM.
we did. It took
Glenn,
50
Mobius needs to at
minutes.
least be a 2-2, okay? I need it for
Glenn, Mobius
Cerebro
needs
2.
to be a 2-1.
KM needs it for the ladder.
Mobius needs to be a 2-1. Make me make decisions, please. Make me think about it. I don't just want to free run this card. Please.